So thank you for joining us, everyone. We're happy to have so many people here, as well as the panelists who have agreed to speak and taking some time. So firstly, I'd like to invite Dolkan Issa, the President of the World Uyghur Congress, to come up and just make a few opening remarks to our conference.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Mehmallah Musafirullah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, speakers, and dear my countrymen. It is my great honor to welcome all of you today on behalf of the World Uyghur Congress to this important event. I would like to thank all of you to attending, especially diverse group of panelists who will be speaking today. This conference comes at a very critical time for the Uyghur people, while this conference will focus particularly on the Uyghur language and cultural rights, which upcoming speaker will discuss in great details. It is important to appreciate that these human rights violations are just one of the part of all broader encompassing strategy of repression and assimilation by the Chinese government. Today, Uyghur identity suffers from serious threats. In other words, the name Uyghur itself has become an alternative word for crime and discriminations. No, we are facing so serious problem, and there are still too much problem need to talk. In August 2016, Chinese government transferred former Secretary of Tibet, Cheng Chang-go, to East Turkestan. Since his arrival to East Turkestan, Cheng Chang-go has implemented more stringent policy, issues series of new regulations that made situation East Turkestan become worse. Chinese government has turned East Turkestan into a police state, and Uyghurs are treated as criminals and second-class citizens. Uyghurs are not able to peacefully practice their religious, fully speak, learn in their mother tongue, or move and express themselves freely. East Turkestan is now covered with Chinese roadblocks, security cameras, and the Chinese police and military officers as the Chinese government seeks to control the Uyghurs. What we are saying now in East Turkestan is more than just repression. It is an intentional campaign and assimilation by the Chinese government targeting Uyghur identity. Everything that makes us unique, or language, or culture, or religious is under attack. As we sit here today, hundreds of thousands of innocent Uyghurs are being arbitrarily detained by Chinese police. Re-education camps across East Turkestan. Almost all Uyghur men are being rounded up and sent to this camp by Chinese police to be politically re-education in order to strip of them their Uyghur identity. Those who are detained are not provided with warrant, are given no access to justice, or are being detained for indefinite period of time. In this way, hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs have effectively disappeared into these camps. At the same time, we are witnessing Chinese influence grow on the world stage. Using promised investment, Chinese government has been gaining leverage over government across the world and pressuring them to remain silent on its human rights abuses. In the United Nations, China is attempting to undermine entire human rights system. Across the world, China is pressuring states to return Uyghur refugees, harassing human rights activists, and arresting family members of any Uyghur living abroad who dare speak out. All friends and relatives still in East Turkestan and Uyghur people as a whole need support from the Uyghur diaspora and the international community to speak loudly on their behalf and hold the Chinese government accountable for its actions. Yesterday, we all saw and attended a big protest action. As Uyghur women around the world, more than 15 countries, in the One Step, One Voice initiative, organized demonstration against the Chinese mass detention of over 1 million Uyghurs in Nazi-style re-education camp in East Turkestan. Today, event like this conference give us hope, seeing all of you here from different backgrounds and interest demonstrate sort of solidarity and concern. We need to create brighter futures. Speaking as a Nobel Peace Center, we must remember all individuals who have changed the world with their tireless pursuit for peace, democracy, and human rights. We must be inspired by the people like Holiness Dalai Lama, Liu Xiaobo, who gives his life pursued democracy and human rights in China. Therefore, these people dedicated their lives to creating a better world. We must have the courage and the motivation to do the same. I wish and believe one day an Uyghur, maybe Professor Ilham Tohti, will be our Nobel Peace Prize in this hall. In response to Chinese government's display of force, control, and violence against Uyghur people, we must recall struggles and the spirit of previous Nobel Prize laureates and loudly demand peace, democracy, and human rights for the Uyghur people until we are heard. In response to Chinese government's attempt to silence the Uyghur language and erode all ties to our culture, we must celebrate our diversity of language and cultures in the world and remember what makes us unique. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you, Dolkan. Secondly, we'd like to have Batyar Omar come up to speak to make some opening remarks as well. He's the chairman of the Norway Uyghur Committee.
Assalamu alaikum, aziz vatandaşlar. God dagen, kjære gjester. Jeg har gleden å velkomme dere til Norge. Vi samles her for å snakke om fred, grunnleggende menneskerettigheter i et land hvor tusenvis av mennesker sitter i fengsler kun for at de truste kritiserer regjeringen for å bevare egne verdier, eget språk, egen religion og egen identitet. Nesten 1 million uskyldige er sendt til omskoleringsleier, og de fleste av dem kun for at de har slektning i utlandet. Situasjonen i det leiret er såpass grusom at folk får ikke mulighet å passe på egen hygiene. Det omskoleringsleiret anses som tidenes konsentrasjonsleier. Ny generasjon får ikke lov å lære eget språk, historie eller religion. Kulturell arv er i stor angrep. Alle uigurene i verden opplever den svarte siden i deres historie. En befolkning på nesten 7 millioner er under aktiv assimileringspolitikk og renses med dagens politisk-økonomisk makt. Språk tar retning mot til å forsvinne. Demokratisk land tør ikke kritisere Kina, og det er svært trist. Med deres taushetshet bidrar de at uskyldige mennesker i Øst-Turkestan angrepes daglig uten noen konsekvenser. Man må huske at nabolandene i Sentral-Asia som hjelper aktivt de kinesiske myndighetene for å presse på uigurene som søkt asyl eller flyktet. I dag opplever de samme situasjonen selv. Diktator aldri har gode formål for hensikt mot de landene de har økonomisk bånd. Den norske Uyghur Committee er en frivillig organisasjon som hjelper uigurene i Norge med integrering til samfunn og veileder norsk uigurer i det sosiale og politiske saker. Siden vårt språk i stadig angrep, har vi annonsert 2018 som morsmålår, hvor vi vil gjøre vårt beste for å kunne bygge en plattform for nye generasjon og lære morsmål ved siden av norsk språk. Den norske Uyghur Komiteen vil fortsette å belyse den alvorlige situasjonen i Øst-Turkestan, blant annet samarbeid med ulike organisasjoner for å avdekke faren av kinesisk tilværelsen. Det er godt å se dere i det Nobel fredssenteret. Og jeg håper på det sterkeste at menneskerettigheter, ytringsfrihet, religionsfrihet og fred er fremdeles en viktig sak for mennesker over andre gevinster. Tusen takk.
Thank you. And then lastly, if we could have some brief remarks from Justin before we start the panel.
Good morning. My name is Josef Goldwet. I'm the Executive Director of the Rafto Foundation. And I'm very pleased and humbled to be here with you today. The Rafto Foundation supports human rights defenders worldwide. Every year, for the last 31 years, we've been handing out a Rafto Award. So far, it has been given to 31 laureates from 28 countries and 5 continents. Normally, we try in our prize committee to find a cause and a laureate that needs the world's attention. In 2004, it was awarded to Ms. Rabia Kadir for her peaceful struggle for the rights of the Uyghur people. And what characterizes the Rafto Award is that we stick with our laureates. We work with them and we try to support them and more or less as long as it takes. So that's why we're also very glad to have the opportunity to co-sponsor this conference, which I think, and as the previous speakers have alluded to, comes at a very critical moment. I think the crackdown we're seeing against the Uyghur people now gives all of us a reason to worry, and even more worrying is it that the world don't address this. The Norwegian government and many other governments don't dare to address what is going on against the Uyghur people, and I think that that's why it's so important also for the Rafto Foundation at this moment that we gather here, that we shed light on what is going on, and we are just very humble, honored, and pleased to be here, and I'm looking forward for the deliberations today. Thank you.
So thank you to all the opening speakers. So now we'd like to transition to the panel discussion. We have 3 speakers, of course, from the Rafto Foundation, Amnesty International, and the Uyghur Human Rights Project, and we'll just go straight into that now. So, as I mentioned before, thank you everyone for coming. As mentioned in some of the opening remarks, it seems like it's hard not to say something like we've reached a fairly unprecedented time. It seems like a bit of a cliche coming out of my mouth to say it's unprecedented, but I think if people are aware of the situation in Kyrgyzstan today, things have gotten drastically worse, certainly in the last year. A year ago, we could have said something similar. The past 2 decades, things have really deteriorated in terms of cultural and religious rights, freedom of movement, sort of the narrative that China's been using in recent years in terms of terrorism and counterterrorism, just the framing of the situation. Securitization in the region has really reached, again, I'm not sure if I can find a different word, but an unprecedented level. The number of security jobs that have been advertised, we've seen skyrocket. In major cities, Uyghurs effectively can't travel freely. And one of the bigger things that's been happening in the last 8 months to a year has been the introduction of what has been termed re-education camps. There are, from what we've seen, estimates ranging from 100 to 200,000 and upwards of 1 million people in these camps. We've seen a few Uyghurs have been able to speak out who have been able to escape the camps. They're in the camps for a few months. Effectively, they're centers, sort of propaganda centers to erode effectively the Uyghur identity. So I think a lot of these issues, we can sort of compartmentalize some of the issues, but I think all of them really do converge. So in terms of language rights, for example, religious freedom, these camps sort of are at some kind of converging point of all of these issues. The identity of the Uyghur people is really being targeted. So today we'd like to speak about language rights, but of course it's in a more broad context of what China's been attempting in recent years. Overall, I think China's really been sort of constructing a certain narrative of what a Uyghur is, what the identity of a Uyghur is, and what it should be in terms of sort of the Chinese government's approach. So with that, if I could have Justine speak first. I think we may change the order a bit. I think Omar wished to speak last in the segment, just so we could get a sense of what's been happening in Norway and sort of the more general sense, if that's okay, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, thanks, Irvin, and thanks again for the invitation to be here. I think following on what I just said, we are talking about this. I think you say the unprecedented moment, and there are. We live in a world where there are a lot of unprecedented things happening these days. But I think what's going on now in East Turkmenistan is really unprecedented, and it's difficult getting enough information out. But what we do here is quite East Turkestan. Yeah, East Turkestan. Yes. And I think just from where we're starting from the Rafto Foundation, this is happening at a time when China's influence is increasing worldwide, partly by China's own making, but it's also with Trump and the lack of U.S. leadership, leaving a vacuum where China has really been able to portray itself as a defender of globalization, increasingly getting more influence on of its values and at the global stage, and this is happening at the same time when we see Chinese leadership entrenching its power more and more internally. And in this, we are looking at Norway, and in Norway now, for the last couple of years, we've seen many efforts to normalize relations with China following the Nobel Peace Prize some years ago. And what is worrying, seen from a Norwegian perspective, is that Norway has for many years and still brands itself as a country standing up for human rights. But the efforts to normalize relationship with China has created this new kind of pragmatism in a way in Norway, where it's become perfectly fine to say among politicians that we are standing up for human rights. Norway is a country that believes in human rights, a UN world-led order based on human rights. But we will not talk about it when it's not in our interest to do so. And it's a new kind of pragmatism that has been is becoming acceptable among Norwegian politicians, and I think that's from where we're sitting very worrying. And there's a certain rationale here being used that, well, you know, we need to, because now it's more important to have trade relations with China, and by just having relations and trade relations, things will get better. China will go in the right direction. And I think what we're seeing just over the last week, in terms of now having a president who can be able to stay on for life, is showing us that that's not what's really happening. So I think from our perspective, I think also why it's so important that we are meeting today, while we're having the conference here today, is that it is important to challenge both the Norwegian government, but also because you're seeing that these signals that the Norwegian government is sending also influences how Norwegian business look to China, and how you know, and it's becoming the space to talk about human rights in relation to China. It's something you don't talk about neither with Norwegian government, with politicians, with businesses, and you could even see it in the university sector. Everybody wants to have a relationship with China, and it's become perfectly legitimate not to talk about human rights in that discourse. So that's also an important reason for us to be here and to co-sponsor this event at this time. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we can probably speak more in depth on those themes as well. But I'd like to give a chance for Gerald Fulford to speak from Amnesty International, and perhaps raise some similar issues in the Norwegian context, and then afterwards we can speak more specifically about other issues as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity of participating in this panel and to discuss this very important issue, which not very often is discussed also in Norwegian public. I am political advisor at Amnesty International and have been working on human rights in China for many, many years. And whenever I talk to Norwegian media, Norwegian politicians about human rights issues, including the Chinese government, I try always to talk about the oppression of Uyghurs. Because everything that is happening in China is also happening against the Uyghurs, only worse. That's the first part of the human rights situation for the Uyghur population. That the general system of oppression that has been built up by the Chinese government and by Chinese authorities over many years, and that has been worsened over recent years, at the same time when China is trying to liberalize its economy, to open up for foreign investments, to modernize how it interacts with the world economy. It seems that the authorities try to compensate for these freedoms they have to grant with steadily increasing oppression, more surveillance, more control, harsher reactions against everybody who is trying to question the system. And that's also very important. That's the second, and it's also very important to see in this context. It's not so much when you talk about freedom of expression and Chinese authorities crack down on freedom of expression, it's not so much that people are being punished for saying anything about the government on buses, but as soon as anybody raises the question of, is China run in the right way? Should it be organized like this? Should we do anything about the structure of the state? Then the government and all the power of the state comes down on that with all their might. And that is also a very important element to have to understand. Yes, China is one of the two major world powers. It is extremely powerful, at least not economically powerful. It is becoming even more powerful in a situation where the traditional leader of the world, the United States, is falling out because they have troubles with their own leadership. And China is filling in on this and saying, okay, we can lead the world. We don't need the Americans. At the same time, my observation of working on human rights violations committed by the Chinese government over many, many years, we have a government, we have a system that's extremely paranoid and extremely afraid of their own population. And that is for me, because I try to understand why are they reacting so extremely harshly and so extremely aggressively against Tibetans and Uyghurs. China has not a bad policy on ethnic minorities. They have actually quite good rules and regulations trying to take care of language rights, for example. It's another question, how do they practice it? But the rules and regulations are not so bad. But there are two important, several, but most strikingly two important exceptions, the rights of Tibetans and the rights of Uyghurs. And it's worse for Uyghurs, because what we see when it comes to the Uyghur population, we see a systematic policy of, one could always say, trying to wipe out Uyghur tradition, culture, and language. We do not see that yet affecting the Tibetan population, although it also goes in that direction. For me, the explanation is that the Chinese authorities are extremely paranoid about their own power. They know they can maintain a system of oppression only when the population accepts it. It's a population of 1.3 billion people if you take the country as a whole, and there is all reason for the authorities to be afraid of them. And so every sign of people saying we want to live our own lives, we do not say what the Chinese authorities say is bad, we do not say it's Chinese way of life is stupid, but you know, we have our own traditions, we have our own language, we have our own culture. That is looked at as extremely dangerous, because it opens for something that must not happen in the Chinese philosophy of governance, namely asking questions whether the system really is the best system in the world. I remember when the predecessor of the now president, the former President Hu, he in his first days in office, one of the first things he said was, we have to try and turn China from a country run by the party to a country run by law. And a few days later, the Chinese news agency came out and said, of course, it did not mean that the Communist Party should not be ruling China. The Communist Party will need to rule China for another 100 years. And this paranoia is there always, this extreme worrying. Can people discover a different way of life, a different way of organizing affairs, when they discover we do not really need this rigid system of oppression? We will talk about Falun Gong today, but the only explanation for the absurd oppression and persecution of Falun Gong practitioners in China is that they offer a different way of life. They are even more dangerous because they're offering it to everybody in China, not just people of a definite ethnic group. So what we see in the regions where the Uyghurs live, we see extreme oppression. We see systematic work, not only to get people who might criticize somebody, but to prove for the rest of the population and for the rest of the world, frankly, your way of life is wrong. It's stupid. And one thing is, we have seen in recent years, the Chinese government is trying more and more to build a structure of laws that help them run a country by law and still having full control. We have cybersecurity laws, we have internal security laws, we have all kinds of laws. They are all stamped as being laws and regulations to protect the population. The cybersecurity law, which gives the government full control about every communication on the internet in China, is defined as a law that's primarily there to take care of people using the internet in China and their security, protect them against internet crime. The same when it comes to the Uyghur population. They say we have to protect the people against themselves. They do not understand the benefits of the modern Chinese state. And so we have to protect them against themselves, and we have to protect them against extremists. And that's the third part of why what we in Amnesty International observe, why the situation for the Uyghurs is so extremely bad, even in the context of Chinese oppression of everybody. And that is that the Chinese authorities discovered that extremism is a very good card to play when one wants to hide human rights violations towards the international community. Uyghurs have been oppressed by Chinese authorities ever since Mao's time. But when working with human rights in China, I have been observing that from September 11, 2001, Chinese authorities almost stopped talking about Uyghur separatism, and they started about Uyghur terrorism. And they defined their extreme oppression, religious persecution, cultural persecution as a participating in a global war on terror. And guess what? The rest of the world agreed and said, okay, now we don't have to talk about Uyghur rights any longer. And that's one of the major challenges we have. We can talk more about this later, but I did a quick search on the website of the Norwegian government, looking where did they talk about Uyghurs in recent years. I found one mentioning that was by the Foreign Ministry, a travel advice for travelers to Thailand. There has been a recent bomb attack in Thailand, and some Uyghur terrorists were suspected of having committed that. That was the only, I'm not saying it's true, of course. There's no proof, but this is the only mentioning. So the Chinese government is trying to tell the world, those standing up for Uyghur rights, these are extremists who want to do something else. And unfortunately, they are succeeding because nobody really wants to challenge China. It's not that anybody believes that story, because it's an absurd story, of course. There is no population in the world of several billion people that consists of extremists. It's just never true. It's not true for the Rohingya in Myanmar. It's not true for any population. But nobody really wants to challenge China because it's good to make trade, to make business with China. And so this is an easy excuse to use. And these are the things we have to challenge, we have to unmask all the time. And all that I'm talking about, this is about people's right to live their lives as they wish to live them, and nothing else. It's not primarily about separatism, it's not primarily about drawing borders, although of course this can be an important issue. It's primarily about the question, are people allowed to live their lives as they choose to live them, which is a basic human right that is accepted for everybody. I stop here. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. You brought up quite a few things that we can talk about later. A few of them at the end. As I mentioned before, China is sort of constructing this kind of narrative in terms of what the Uyghurs are, what they're professing to be. And I think the role of the World Uyghur Congress and other organizations really should be to challenge that narrative and show the international community that there is a more accurate narrative that should be told. I read PEN America just put out a report on social media control by the government just last week, or I think it might have been this week actually. And you also raised the fact that, yeah, there is sort of China, and then there's also Tibet and East Turkestan. They're very separate, and actually in the report itself it said there's sort of reasonable freedom in terms of, perceived freedom in terms of people's actions on social media, but China is quite a different case than Tibet and East Turkestan. East Turkestan and Tibet, you just, for example, a woman was jailed for 3 years a few months ago for posting a chronic verse on social media, and again that sort of goes back to the fact that a lot of these issues are sort of converging, so that deals with religious freedom, freedom of expression, and sort of controls on expression online as well. Yeah, then we can speak more about that. And also you mentioned about sort of law, the country being ruled by law. We'll have a Tibetan speaker speak in the second segment about Tashi Wangchuk, who was jailed for effectively making this video with the New York Times, this short piece, and he's sort of been petitioning the government. And he makes a very strong point saying that I'm trying to work within China's legal system. He didn't try to move outside the system. He actually he went to the police station, he went to the courts and said, I have problems, I feel like the regional government is not respecting China's laws that they've actually set out. And he was jailed for it. Ilan Tohti presents kind of a similar case. We can speak about that more. He really tried to work within the system, but he was also punished for it. With that, I think we'll move on to Omar Kanat, the director of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, who will speak more specifically about Uyghur language rights in East Turkestan today.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everybody. So it was very useful. It has been very useful to hear ideas from other speakers, but it was very interesting. And it is this, sort of solidarity, sharing ideas that, helps Uyghurs to improve the Uyghur situation. And of course, one thing you mentioned, why China is so reacting so extremely against the Uyghur people. Really, China is paranoid to losing control of the East Turkestan, because the Uyghurs in the East Turkestan, the strategic importance of the region, rise, because of this new Chinese president initiative, One Belt One Road, and so Chinese government want to use this area as a springboard to expand its influence in Central Asia, in Middle East. So therefore the region in the strategic importance is rising. So therefore China is paranoid, and also China is paranoid in another term, that they think there is a perception that the Western anti-China forces will use the Uyghurs, to split China and create, prevent China's expansion. So this is one of the perceptions that exist in China. And also, this new party secretary, of course, he used to be party secretary in Tibet, as Dolkun indicated. So turn this region to a war zone. It's almost a police state, and hundreds of checkpoints between cities, and in every 2 blocks in cities all around the East Turkestan. And now he uses also, China uses very highly advanced, surveillance technology, millions of, cameras, monitoring almost all Uyghurs, movements, and they also obligate the Uyghurs to, install a GPS in their cars so they can, follow them everywhere. And also this is also a very egregious, violation of the human rights that the Chinese government forcefully, by coercion and threat, collecting the DNA samples of the Uyghur people, and the Uyghur people cannot challenge what the government in the future, for what purpose the Chinese government will use this information. So, but today I will talk about, specifically about the Chinese government's policy, repressive policy on Uyghur language, and because Chinese government somehow to intend to to eliminate Uyghur language, and so force all the Uyghurs, especially the young Uyghur generation, to learn Uyghurs through many policies. And of course there is threats posed to its continued use and existence of the Uyghur language. Language is of course an essential part of the social fabric and identity of any nation, and it forms an important bond between the Uyghur people and structures our experience of the world. However, the Uyghur language has come under attack from a series of repressive policies introduced by the Chinese government. While efforts have been going on, to prevent the use of the Uyghur language for decades, we have witnessed a marked escalation in these efforts in the last 5 years, especially in the last 5 years. The attack on the Uyghur language is part of broader campaign of the, of course, Chinese policy to assimilate the Uyghur people. In the past 5 years, particularly in 2017, we have witnessed the implementation of a coordinated and systematic attack on the Uyghur identity. As the Uyghur people have their own culture, religion, history, and ancestral land, Xi Jinping sees this as a threat to his absolute power. This is also the case with the Tibetan and Southern Mongolians. To solidify its power and assert control over the Uyghur population in their resourceful land, the Chinese government has targeted the things that make the Uyghur people unique, which forms the core of the Uyghur identity. In the past few years, we have seen ever-escalating restrictions on the attack on our religion, culture, and importantly, the Uyghur language. The strategy of the Chinese government has focused especially on the influencing young Uyghurs in an attempt to diminish the importance of Uyghur language with the younger generation and sever their ties to their ethnic Uyghur identity. The approach appears to have two main focuses: discouraging the use of the Uyghur language among the young Uyghurs through language bans and bilingual education classes, and encouraging the use of the Mandarin Chinese through preferential access to employment, universities, and government positions to those who speak Mandarin. China's efforts to assimilate the Uyghur population has been acknowledged in official policy, with Xi Jinping and his allies have explicitly referenced ethnic intermingling as the policy solution to ethnic issues in China. While learning Mandarin is not wrong in itself, it is the Chinese government's effort to totally erode Uyghur language and replace it with the Mandarin that's the problem. For the regional government, bilingual education does not mean to maintain both Mandarin and Uyghur language at the same level in terms of teaching, but translation of Uyghur students at all levels, from education in their mother tongue to education in Chinese. In practice, the program prohibits young Uyghurs from being taught in the Uyghur language and even prevents them from speaking to one another in their mother tongue between classes or on the campuses. It reveals that the Chinese government's intention is not to promote communication or intercultural dialogue, but to supplant the Uyghur language. It shows that the Chinese government does not appreciate and celebrate the Uyghur identity as it claims, but rather has increasingly had a homogeneous conception of China with the Han Chinese ethnicity at its center. In this approach by the Chinese government, there is an inherent false assumption that the Chinese language and culture is superior, that the Uyghur language and culture is disposable or even a hindrance. It is worth noting that learning the Uyghur language is not a prerequisite for Han Chinese students in the region and rest of China. Furthermore, funding for the bilingual education program has been drastic increases over the last 2 decades, as well as the share of number of Uyghurs enrolled. In 1995, 5,500 students were enrolled in bilingual schools. By 2007, it was 294,000. By 2010, 994,000. And by 2012, 1,410,000. The regional government has now set a target of 2,600,000 students in East Turkestan by 2020, which constitutes nearly all non-Han Chinese students in the region. It's very worrisome, figures. Uyghur teachers are forced to teach in Mandarin or have trouble finding employment, while the regional government is bringing in thousands of Mandarin-speaking teachers to East Turkestan from mainland China. This past year, Chinese authorities have done away with any pretense of promoting Uyghur and Mandarin simultaneously and have instead opted to implement a ban on the Uyghur language at all levels of education in Khotan Prefecture. The ban went into effect on September 1st, 2011, at the start of the school semester. It not only banned the use of Uyghur as the language of instruction in classrooms, but also prevent Uyghur students from speaking Uyghur outside of class on school premises. Even the Chinese government's, given the Chinese government's propensity for testing policies at a lower level before enacting them as a national policy, we are very concerned that the language ban will soon extend to the whole region. The right of the children to receive an education in their native language is enshrined in international law, most explicitly in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as China's own regional ethnic autonomy law. Learning in one's native language is very important in the formation of cultural identity, and as the most recent annual report from the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education emphasizes, students learn best when they are taught in their native language. The language ban is therefore a clear violation of international law, China's own domestic law, and human rights norms. In addition to the bilingual education classes and outright ban on the use of the Uyghur language in schools, young Uyghurs are heavily pressured and incentivized to prioritize learning and using Mandarin Chinese for the sake of their future professional and academic ambitions. This is why this issue and therefore this conference today is so important to us. I fear that if nothing has changed and international community continue to stay silent, the younger generation of Uyghurs still living in East Turkestan will be cut off from their mother tongue and their culture. This would not only lead to a signification of the Uyghur people, the world would lose a truly unique language in a rich culture. It will also sever the ties between the Uyghur people, between older and the younger generations, and between those in East Turkestan and diaspora. This is what is at stake. The fate of the Uyghurs as a unique people and the continued existence of the Uyghur language and culture. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Omar. It's quite remarkable when you go into the details of what's actually happening to the language. And some of the things that you mentioned, so one of the prefectures, Hotan Prefecture, which is overwhelmingly it's Uyghur, I think it's close to 85–90%. It seems to be that the most intense policies are the places in the south and the west where Uyghurs are mostly present. And I think maybe to start things off, I think we've touched on perhaps some of the reasons why the party has been doing these things, but the question that I tend to ask most people I speak to who have worked on China before is, yeah, we've seen paranoia and fear of the people, but it seems like there must be something more. China often talks about stability maintenance sort of as a policy, so we're doing this for stability maintenance, but I think any half-intelligent person could probably tell you that these policies and pushing of people sort of to the limit of their existence, there's going to be some kind of effect to it. So I'm wondering if really any of the speakers could speak on, is there something beyond sort of fear and paranoia that you've seen in the past, or in the present, I suppose, now? What is driving these policies? Why are they so intense? Is there pressure within the party? Because you've seen the party secretary, who of course at the 19th Party Congress back in October, who has been promoted to the Politburo, and perhaps that's a motivation for why these policies are going the way they're going. But as I mentioned, I think pushing people to this limit clearly is counterintuitive in terms of if your approach is to get stability maintenance, if you want to maintain stability in the region, it seems like it's completely counterintuitive. So I wonder if any of the speakers could speak on this, if there's something more that we're missing in terms of China's approach.
Yeah, I think the declining of the weight of democracy and human rights in the foreign policy of the Western countries, playing the most important role in intensifying Chinese repression. And also the lack of reaction to the Chinese repression in the region is also encouraged the Chinese government to continue its repression. And because China, testing the reaction of the international community. They started when in East Turkestan, the recent repression started with the targeting first the religious people. When China, tested the reaction of international community, when it saw there is no, reaction from international community, so then Chinese authorities began to target the other parts of the Uyghur community. Then they began to arrest the business people. There was no reaction. Then they started to target the Uyghur intellectuals. Now the whole Uyghur community. If there is no reaction from international community, then this is many people say this is what is going on in East Turkestan is the early signs of a cultural genocide. So it will turn to a full cultural genocide if there is no reaction. So therefore we call on international community to react now. And then China will. This is very important. We see this from the Dolkon's, the decision of the Interpol to delete Dolkon's name from the Red Notice. There was a reaction from international community. Although the president of the Interpol is Chinese, many people thought they will never make any decision to delete Dolkon's name from the Red Notice. But the reaction, there was a reaction, and there was a lot of pressure on Interpol. Although the president was a Chinese, but they decided to delete his name. So if there is a reaction, then there will be some action from Chinese side. But if there is no reaction, then China will continue to do. Now Chinese authorities feel free that they can do anything because the international community gave already signaled the Chinese authorities that there will be no consequences while China is tightening its control in the region.
And also just, I think others can probably speak to, what's happening within the party. But I think, it's, looking at what's happening here, both with linguistic rights, crackdown, re-education camps, it's pretty obvious what's happening here. And I think China is doing, they are in the midst, we're talking about this paranoia in China. They're doing what they're trying to do to combine economic growth, higher GDP, aspiration of 1.3 billion people, to have more material wealth, to become middle class. There are a few countries that have succeeded in doing that without also those aspirations turning into aspirations for democratic rights and human rights and so on. That's what you see in all the other places. I think in some ways, China's paranoia is quite legitimate because they are in an experiment that this can with the economic developments in China, but also with the tensions, both with the inequalities, with the urban-rural divide, with ethnic groups. I think there are a lot of there are a lot of tensions here that could spur into challenge towards the party, and I think that combined with that, what's going on in the world with Trump in the US, with Brexit, and with the UK government trying to make whatever alliances they need outside the EU, they feel that this is the time when they can do this. And I think that what Omar is saying, that they're testing us, and so far the response has been to say that, well, you can go on, China, with this.
I can, as I said, Peter, the question you ask, I've been asking myself for many years, but I can try to at least add some thoughts to that. One is that I once read a number that, according to Chinese government figures, every year there are between 50,000 to 80,000 local uprisings in the country. 50,000 to 80,000. That's people in a village rising up in often violent protests against some local measures. And there is really huge concern that one of these might become a big thing. And we see that sometimes Chinese authorities react when local issues become big issues and try to show we are doing something. So there is this real concern about people, because we're talking about positive development, economic development, fight against poverty in China and all that, and much of that is true, but there are millions and millions of people falling through. An early result of the Chinese economic opening was that 40% of the population missed their access to a local doctor because they suddenly had to pay for healthcare and couldn't afford it. This is a huge issue because it means people having to stay home to take care of their parents. Something like that, and they have been trying to fix that ever since. There is an army almost of over 100, maybe 120 million people traveling all over China as internal labor migrants, people who come from the countryside who cannot live any longer on the soil because all the investments are pumped into the big cities. And people who have no rights, more or less, who are open for any kind of exploitation by their employers. Most of them do not even have a labor contract. There are many such things that are happening, and at the same time, the government is trying to maintain this theory of power that obviously the only way to run this country is based on the Communist Party. And that is very, very important. And it seems to me that this is in the core of all the issues. We can never admit that there is another possibility. And the Uyghur way of life, the Tibetan way of life, clearly offers an alternative, showing people living happily in another system. That cannot happen, that cannot be accepted. And in combination with this, we have to understand that China has a political system that has kind of perfectionized bullying as a major method of politics. The almost gut reaction of a representative of Chinese authorities, if anybody annoys them, is to strike down. The almost gut reaction of a Chinese policeman, if anybody annoys him, is to beat up this person. Because this is the way it's done. If a whole people is saying, we want to live our lives as we will, then the gut reaction of the government is, okay, then let's just crash them. And if nobody stands up, then we can do whatever we want. I think it's not so much that they are very concerned about Uyghur identity. I certainly do not believe they're concerned about separatism, because we are talking about the country with the second largest army in the world. I mean, it's just not any military separation is just not a realistic scenario. But it is, we crush them because we can, because it's the easiest way out. But that also gives us a chance of unmasking that system, of showing there is something seriously wrong in that system, not just hailing China for promoting progress, not least filling our pockets, but in the West, but also showing there is something seriously wrong with this system, and it doesn't have to be so, because there is no reason why there shouldn't be economic growth and fight against poverty without oppression or oppression of cultural identity.
Yeah. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, what I want to say is the situation in mainland China and East Turkestan is very different. So in mainland China, of course, there is a repression, the repressive government, but the repression in East Turkestan had other nature. So it targets a whole people, to eliminate the whole people with its language, culture, and history. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite important. And I think cultural. I mean, genocide is quite a strong term and it has legal implications. But cultural genocide, I think you can certainly start to make at least an academic argument to suggest that that's effectively what's been happening. I wanted to transition, since we have a couple speakers from the Norwegian context. As mentioned before, I think China's been they've become more emboldened, and there's been sort of a slow growth in these policies, sort of, as we mentioned before, testing the waters to see what the international community will say. I didn't really know too much about Norway's, I knew about the Nobel situation, but I wasn't quite aware of the breakdown in sort of diplomacy between the countries for 6 years or so. So I wonder if we can speak about this. I think it was in 2010. After Liu Xiaobo was given the prize, there was effectively a breakdown in the relations. And then in 2016, when I believe a couple years after the Conservative Party was voted in, there was a document, and I'd like to quote it quickly to sort of set up this. We don't have so much more time, but there's a 2-page document sort of to mend the relations between Norway and China. And one of the paragraphs said, quote, Norway fully respects China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, attaches high importance to China's core interests and major concerns, will not support actions that undermine them, and will do its best to avoid any future damage to bilateral relations. I mean, that's quite incredible, especially when they talk about territorial integrity, which the Liu Xiaobo case doesn't even really present that issue at all. Even Ilham Tohti, who never called for separatism, they called him a separatist, and he's won a couple of human rights awards. So I'm wondering if we can speak briefly about just sort of Norway's role and China feeling emboldened, and also the decision, this statement was made, I think a couple weeks after the election of Trump in 2016. So I wonder if we can speak briefly about sort of Norway's role in recent years. Go first.
Well, it's a depressing story, of course. What's interesting with this document is, I mean, almost the same document, memorandum of understanding that was signed with between the Norwegian and the Chinese government could easily have been signed between the Norwegian and the German government, because obviously it's part of international diplomacy not to try to undermine the other one and not to undermine sovereignty and territorial integrity and all that, and that's just part of basic international diplomacy. What's important in this case is that what is always between the lines is as defined by the Chinese authorities. So it's not so much that the Norwegians say, okay, we do not want to undermine your control of the country, but what they really say is the Chinese tell us what they consider undermining their position. And that's interesting because the same thing Chinese penal law says. Chinese penal law says leaking state secrets to a foreign power is a serious offense, which is in every country in the world. But leaking state secrets to foreign power, in the case of Ria Kader, means to hand a local newspaper to an American congressman, which he could board at the next street corner. And and that's very important that the Norwegians have said to the Chinese, you tell us what we're allowed to do and you tell us what we're not allowed to do. And that's really dramatic because there is a lot of different opinions about what really happened after the Nobel Peace Prize for Liu Xiaobo, and many people say, the Chinese punished Norway on all the areas where it wasn't really important. Lots of corporations continued, economy continued, salmon export skyrocketed in some of the years when there officially was an economic boycott. But what was important is that China used Norway as an example. Look what's happening. If you annoy us, we are coming down on us. Something similar happened a few years earlier when Canada granted honorary citizenship to the Dalai Lama. And one of the things that happened was that a Canadian citizen had a Uyghur background, was apprehended in another Central Asian country, if I remember correctly, Uzbekistan, yeah, handed to the Chinese authorities and was executed there, obviously to punish his government. And so Norway became an important example for the Chinese. If you irritate us, we are coming down on you just as we are coming down on our own population. The sad thing is that Norway had no reason to bow under. I mean, if any country could afford annoying the Chinese, it's Norway. But there was so much pressure. I mean, it was in TV discussions with representatives of the economy who were trying to tell the government, please, you have to just bow and apologize and everything because we want to earn more money. And it's so sad that really, in the end, won the argument. Not we are losing money because nobody could really prove that we were losing money, but we want to have the opportunity to do business.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I read as well, and it was a bit confusing. I think in 2015, the trade relations were at an all-time high, and I was just a bit confused as to why that was the case. Where sort of more rhetorically they were speaking in different terms.
And I can also just allude to that. I think it's what you're saying, that in many ways, despite the freeze, there was a lot of trade going on between Norway and China, and as a Rafto Foundation, we are not against having trading relationships, and it's not like we are against that. But what is the but the diplomatic freeze was a huge shock, and I don't think it's only for the Conservative Party. I think you would have had more of the same reaction here from if it was a Labour government, or it was and this normalization towards China was considered quite broadly, one of the few foreign policy successes of our former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and it's being hailed as this kind of very important diplomatic achievement when you had our Prime Minister being received in China, and when Norwegian flags all over Beijing, many Norwegian politicians were very proud that we finally were accepted in the warmth again. And on that way, we don't know that much about what compromises have been made on that journey. But we have seen a few examples that have been quite embarrassing. One of them being when the Dalai Lama was invited to Norway by civil society, and he was not allowed to be received at the main hall of the Norwegian Parliament by the Speaker of the Norwegian Parliament, who had been formerly the chair of the Norwegian Tibet Committee, or sort of the Tibet Solidarity Committee in the Norwegian Parliament, and he was not allowed to enter the main entrance of Parliament. He had to be taken into the back door. He was not allowed to use the main speaking hall at the Norwegian Parliament. He was speaking in the basement. In there, and that was something that I think many Norwegians reacted to, and I think also when we learned that Liu Xiaobo was terminally ill, there were calls that he should be able to leave China to get medical treatment. Norway's silence during those weeks and days were quite embarrassing and very noticeable. And what I think and this is going back to what I said in the beginning, still there has become this new kind of pragmatism there, because Norway still, it's important for Norway, it's important for whatever government we have, including this government, to say that we are standing up for human rights. On many issues, towards many countries, this government take a bold stance on human rights and speak up against other governments. Recently, when another Rafto laureate, Nabil Rajab, was in prison for tweeting in Bahrain, then Norway stands up and says, and calls on Bahrain to release him. But there is this thing that it's become the new normal is that you can choose, and you can openly say that in this case, against China, it's not in our interest to raise these issues. And it's become normal to say that. And I think this year we are marking the 70-year anniversary for the UN Human Rights Declaration. It's the 20-year anniversary for the UN Declaration of Human Rights Defenders. And what you kind of also hear within political circles, within business circles, is this also thinking that that also within Norway, within a country that has been standing up for human rights for many years, you're saying that, well, but we shouldn't push our values on other countries. We shouldn't, human rights is, Western values. We need to accept that China represents an alternative. And I think that the importance of what the work that you're doing is that, well, but China is really, this is not about, China is not practicing multiculturalism at home. This is not about, allowing people to have their values and live their lives, and what we're talking about today is an example of that. And I think it's important to, as we are marking the 70th anniversary of the UN Human Rights Declaration, we need to really stand up, and we need to really challenge these narratives where you're trying to relativize human rights, and that's why it's important that we're sitting here today and talking about what you're doing here today.
If I may just add a quick thought. One thing that's important to see is that the story is quite different when the cameras are off.
Yeah.
Norway is working quite actively in the United Nations on China issues. Right now, the Norwegian delegation at the Human Rights Council is standing together with other countries to try and counter a very important Chinese resolution trying to undermine the human rights system. They are very active, taking up issues in China in connection with the Universal Periodic Review, which is coming up again. I'm very curious what's going to happen then. So, and that's probably an area where it's much easier also to work on these issues, which we must not forget.
Yeah, sure. I think we'll just have the panel stay. We have Speaker Nicholas Wilkinson, and if you would like to say a few words now, and maybe we can have the panelists stay and take some questions afterwards and make any further statements. So if you wouldn't mind.
Whilst you are all there, that's very scary. Well, thank you. I was asked to just come by. I sit in the Norwegian Parliament for the Socialist Left Party, and I'm very happy to be here because of the work you do not only for Uyghurs, but also for the rest of the world. The fight for language and language and culture is about self-determination. It's about freedom for people to act out on who they are and the culture they have. I'm multicultural. I'm half British, half Norwegian. It makes me proud and happy that I can celebrate both my cultures, but I live in countries where that is very easy. Standing up against oppressive governments is the duty of all people, but especially of nations that have the power and the economic power to do so. And as I've said, Norway has done so at some occasions. They do use that power in some international forums, but not enough. And I think I don't know if you've already talked about it, but I must admit I was quite ashamed when the Dalai Lama came to Norway. You of course know of Tibet and their struggles. They struggle with a lot of the same issues that you have done. And he came, and not a single person in the Norwegian government wanted to even meet him. Because they were more interested in selling fish to the Chinese regime than to stand up for human rights. And when fish is valued higher than human rights, we have serious issues with how Western democracies are fulfilling their duty to people around the world on following up on human rights. Oppressive regimes around the world have always feared minorities. Minorities are always difficult because I think all regimes that are oppressive want people to adhere to a certain dogma, a way of life, a way of living that they have decided is the right one. Whether it's the Iranian Muslim regime, it's the North Korean communists, it's the Chinese regime, minorities are always a threat because they so visibly stand up against the ruling elite that decides what is good and what is bad. You've seen this with indigenous people in Latin America, Indians, throughout the ages. We see it with West Saharans in Morocco. We see it with Palestinians in Israel and Palestine. And in Norway, in our own history, we like to be so proud, but we saw it with the Sami people, our indigenous people in the north, where we force them into Norwegian culture, we force them into Norwegian education, we force them to not use their own language. You, of course, know these issues because it is the very same issues that you struggle with. So minorities have always been a threat, but the control is a lie. You can't control the human mind. So as long as there are minorities, as long as there are free minds, people always stand up to these oppressive regimes. But the minorities like you are often the ones that bear the brunt of the boot, that are stepped upon in the attempt to create control. And therefore, I would especially wish for you to also work on, I know you work on all these issues, but especially since you are a Muslim minority, or largely Muslim minority, I want to say that that is an added dimension that is so important in the world today. Because that's not just a struggle for you, that is a struggle all around the world, all around the Western world and in Norway. With rising racism, hateful rhetoric, and an unimaginable view of people that hold another religion. In Norway, we've just had a public debate with a minister in the government that said that the Labour Party, a different party, wants to support terrorists. We've had one terrorist in Norway, a white, right-wing Norwegian. Who do you think she used as a picture of a terrorist? It wasn't a white Norwegian. It was a visible persona of a Muslim terrorist. The fear-mongering in the West is putting people against each other. For you, it's about culture and language, but it's also about the fight for religious self-determination, for letting every single person decide what they believe to keep their culture and to keep their language. And therefore, I want to say thank you very much for being here, for choosing this venue, which I think speaks a lot about your struggle. But I want to say good luck with your struggle, but most of all, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you because your struggle is not only about your own struggle, but it is about the same struggle that minorities have all over the world. The struggle for self-determination, the struggle for language, the struggle for your own religion. And I see it as our duty, especially in the Western world, to stand up for those values, to stand with you in your struggles, and to use the power we have in international forums, in international negotiations, to fight for minorities' rights. And when push comes to shove, also when the media is there, not just in the back room, when someone like the Dalai Lama comes, when ethnic minorities, religious groups come to Norway, it is the duty of the Norwegian government and Norwegian MPs to stand with you in your fight. So thank you very much. I wish I could stay here with you. It is a mayhem day today, so sadly I cannot stay. I have to go back to Parliament for a vote. But I wish you all the best of luck, and I look forward to cooperation, which we've already started in the Norwegian Parliament, and our continued work for peace and freedom, not just for you, but for all minorities in the world. So best of luck.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a quick note, I think, on I've spoken to a lot of Uyghurs about this sort of the word framing sort of Uyghurs as a minority. Now, of course, they're a minority within all of China, but I think it sort of rubs some Uyghurs the wrong way because, of course, Uyghurs, historically speaking, were the majority population in what is East Turkestan now. The past 50 years, we've seen Chinese being sort of pushed by the government into the region. So, of course, there's some sensitivities there, and that kind of speaks to how we can sort of frame this situation. So, not myself, but Uyghurs themselves, are they seen as a minority, or are they seen as a sort of a group sort of struggling for more autonomy or self-determination? We have a few minutes left. I'm wondering if there are any questions from the participants. Sure, yeah.
Actually, you a little earlier, you want to dig out the reason for Chinese government why it has so increased the assimilation process of Bengal language. Just what actually mine is a little bit comment on this issue. It is I guess it's the part of the Chinese history because Chinese expansion mostly happened by assimilating people. Today, for example, Chinese says there are 56 nationalities. In fact, if you look around, you see just 3 distinct people left: Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongols. The rest of them all assimilated. Assimilation means the southern part of China, for example, Fujian, Guangzhou. Those the provinces are totally made up different ethnic groups, but assimilated. And so what is happening in Tibet, East Turkestan, and southern Mongolia is those distinct group of people, Uyghurs, Tibetans, they are resisting against Chinese assimilation. And the Chinese governments, what Chinese governments basically saying is, we need your land, we don't need your people, owner of it. So that is the one way he just put in simplistic language. And another thing from the Chinese culture is, Chinese people see themselves as the center of the world. They are heavenly people, and all other people except Chinese are barbaric. So they have to be eliminated. It is the part of the Sun's teaching and the Asian Chinese teaching. So Chinese, heavenly people, others, barbaric people should be eliminated, should be assimilated. So it is also part of Chinese tradition and culture. And the current Chinese regime, extra nationalistic or chauvinistic regime, just using the old tactic with the new language. Otherwise, there's no change in the Chinese constitution. Still linguistic right, autonomy, everything is there. But when look at the actual policy of Communist Party, it is totally against the old constitution. This is the thing that I would like to add my voice.
Right, I think, and you see the language in terms of Uyghurs and Tibetans. They do even use the word sort of barbaric, sort of other people who are just not Chinese that need to be assimilated. Yes, that's a good comment. Is there anyone else who had something? Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, in Norway, we usually teach our children not to bully. And that is a simple, basic thing. We teach from kindergarten. But at the same time, we let ourselves, the governments, let themselves be bullied by the Chinese government. Because dialogue in Chinese vocabulary, there isn't such thing as dialogue, it's monologue. It's the Chinese who tell you to do one thing or the other. So I do not understand how are we putting our values on them when we are just actually trying to show the children that we shouldn't take the bullies and shouldn't be bullies. And how difficult is it to show that we shouldn't accept it? To you.
Did anyone have a comment?
Well, just on what you're saying there, I think that what you also see is that China don't seem to respect countries that let themselves be bullied by China. So I think there is a certain short-termism of the Norwegian policy on China and trying to cozy up and allow oneself to be bullied. I think it's a short-term strategy. It's not the way that China respects you as a government. And as we see now with, as I said initially, on what we've seen the last week of the developments with the leadership of China, it's not the strategy chosen by Norway and some other countries. It has not made China more democratic or in any way. They are more entrenching their power, and I think we should learn from that. So, yes.
Yeah, I think we'll have to wrap up. Did you want to try?
Just one thing.
Sure.
First of all, what happened with regarding the Dalai Lama in Norway is sending a very wrong signal to Chinese authorities. China now will ask for more. It will not stop. And the second thing is what's regarding the Chinese policy in Tibet and in East Turkestan. It has a risk for all international community because there are other countries who are following Chinese policies, in East Turkestan, in Tibet. So they are following very, very closely how what will the reaction of the international community will be to Chinese policy in the region. If there is no reaction, then they will, follow the Chinese example to solve their own ethnic problems. So.
Yeah, it seems like China's sort of presenting an alternative model in terms of how global leadership. Yeah, with that, I think I would like to wrap up. I wonder if the panelists had any other brief comments to make to conclude, or anything else you observed so far. Yeah, I think that was fantastic. I think we'll take a quick break just to sort of reset, and then we'll have 3 more speakers in about 5 to 10 minutes. So thanks. And thanks to the speakers. Yeah.